March 1965, and Frank Lucas was about to betray the only man who ever treated him like family, because staying loyal meant staying small, and Frank Lucas refused to be small. Frank sat in his car outside Bumpy Johnson's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him from floating away. Inside that building was Bumpy, 60 years old, Harlem's most powerful black gangster, the man who'd saved Frank's life 10 years ago when Frank was nobody from North Carolina with nothing but ambition and a chip on his shoulder. Bumpy had taught Frank everything: how to read people, how to move product, how to survive in a game designed to kill men like them. For 10 years, Frank had been the perfect student, driving Bumpy around, watching, learning, waiting. But Frank had just discovered something Bumpy would never approve of: a direct pipeline to heroin suppliers in Southeast Asia, pure product for $4,000 per kilo instead of the $50,000 they paid Italian middlemen. The kind of opportunity that could make them millions more than Bumpy ever imagined. The problem: Bumpy had a code: never betray the Italians, never disrupt the established order, never let ambition override loyalty. Going direct would violate everything Bumpy believed in. Frank glanced at the briefcase on his passenger seat, filled with notes, numbers, projections. Proof that this could work, proof that they could revolutionize the entire drug trade. But Bumpy wouldn't see it as revolution, he'd see it as betrayal. Frank killed the engine. He could stay in this car, throw away the briefcase, remain Bumpy's loyal driver forever. Stay small, stay safe, stay nobody. Or he could walk through that door and pitch the opportunity anyway, knowing it would end one of two ways. Bumpy says yes, and they build an empire together. Or Bumpy says no, and Frank has to choose between loyalty and ambition. Frank grabbed the briefcase and stepped out of the car. Because Frank Lucas understood something Bumpy didn't understand yet. The game was changing, and men who refused to change with it didn't stay kings for long. What happened over the next 3 years would determine who controlled Harlem's future and destroy the only relationship Frank Lucas ever actually cared about. March 1965. The former Army supply sergeant was 3 drinks deep when he mentioned the Golden Triangle, and Frank Lucas leaned forward like a man who'd just heard the future whispered in his ear. "Thailand," the sergeant said, swirling cheap bourbon. "Opium fields far as you can see. They're refining it right there. 95% pure heroin for $4 grand a kilo. $4 grand. You know what that costs here?" Frank knew exactly what it cost here. $50,000 per kilo, filtered through Corsican smugglers and Italian Mafia middlemen who took their cut at every step. The math exploded in Frank's head like lightning. They could buy 12 kilos for what they currently paid for 1. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank made calls, followed connections, verified everything. It was real. Direct sourcing from Southeast Asia would cut out every middleman, every markup, every limitation. They could 10x their profits overnight. That afternoon, Frank drove Bumpy through Harlem as usual, watching his 60-year-old mentor move slowly through the neighborhood. Bumpy stopped every block, greeting shopkeepers, checking on corner boys, maintaining relationships built over 40 years. Powerful, but cautious. Respected, but limited. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I love this man," he thought, "but he's holding me back." That evening, Frank knocked on Bumpy's apartment door. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from possibility. "Boss," Frank said when Bumpy opened the door, "I found something that could change everything for us." Bumpy studied Frank's face, seeing the excitement burning there, the hunger that had always made Frank different from the others. "Let's talk." Bumpy poured 2 glasses of cognac while Frank spread papers across the coffee table like a general planning war. "Thailand," Frank said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Thailand, Golden Triangle, direct source, $4,000 per kilo for 95% pure. We're paying $50,000 for product half that quality. Boss, we could make millions more than we're making now. We could be bigger than anyone, Italian, Irish, anyone. All we have to do is go direct. Bumpy leaned forward, studying the numbers. Where exactly is the source? Northern Thailand, near the Burmese border. Opium fields controlled by local warlords. Who's the contact? Former Army supply sergeant, ran logistics in Vietnam, still has connections to military transport. How would shipping work? Frank had answers for everything. He'd done his homework, mapped every detail, calculated every risk. For 20 minutes, he laid it out like a professor teaching class. Then Bumpy shook his head. Frank, you don't understand the game. The Italians aren't just suppliers, they're partners. We have an arrangement. They control supply, we control distribution in Harlem. That arrangement keeps peace. You start going around them, you start a war. So we stay small forever because of some arrangement you made 20 years ago? Frank's frustration leaked through. Boss, the game is changing. We can change with it or get left behind. The game doesn't change as much as you think. Bumpy's voice carried 40 years of survival. Men who last understand that stability is more valuable than growth. Fast growth brings attention. Federal, mafia, everybody. I've lasted 40 decades by being smart, not greedy. Bumpy stood, placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. Frank, you're like a son to me. I'm telling you this because I care. Don't do this. The money isn't worth the problems it will bring. We have a good thing here. Don't destroy it chasing something bigger. Frank gathered his papers in silence. He understood now. Bumpy would never approve, would never see the vision, would never let Frank become more than a driver. That night, Frank dialed the number for Thailand. I'm interested, he said. Let's talk details. 3 months later, Frank held 12 kilos of 95% pure heroin in his Harlem apartment, $50,000 worth of product that would have bought him 1 kilo through Bumpy's Italian connections. His Army sergeant contact had delivered it through military supply chains from Vietnam, hidden among body bags and equipment shipments nobody inspected too closely. Frank cut a sample, tested it, cut it again. Even after diluting it 9 times, the product was better than anything on Harlem's streets. He smiled, thinking of a name that would make it legendary. Blue Magic. He started with the young dealers, hungry kids without deep loyalty to Bumpy. Frank offered better product at better prices. Within weeks, they were switching sides, whispering about this new supplier who was changing the game. During the day, Frank played his role perfectly. Drove Bumpy around Harlem, opened doors, carried bags, acted like nothing had changed. But at night, Frank was building an empire using Bumpy's territory, Bumpy's connections, Bumpy's trust. By late August, Bumpy started noticing. Dealers making less money, corners less profitable, Frank being vague about his whereabouts. "Frank, is everything okay?" Bumpy asked one afternoon, studying his protégé's face. "Everything's fine, boss. Just a usual business." The lie tasted like ash. September brought the inevitable. Illinois Gordon, one of Bumpy's oldest dealers, came to the apartment on Edgecombe Avenue with news that made Bumpy's chest tighten. "Boss, there's new product on the streets, better than ours, purer, cheaper." Gordon hesitated. "And Frank Lucas is the one moving it." Bumpy sat down slowly, feeling something crack inside him that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with betrayal. He picked up the phone, dialed Frank's number. "We need to talk," Bumpy said quietly. "And this time, I want the truth." Frank arrived at Bumpy's apartment knowing the performance was over. Bumpy sat in his chair like a judge, and the disappointment in his eyes cut deeper than any anger could. "I taught you everything," Bumpy said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I saved you when you had nothing. I treated you like a son. And you've been operating behind my back for 3 months?" "Boss, you wouldn't listen when I came to you with the opportunity." Frank stood his ground, even as guilt clawed at his throat. You said no because you're afraid of changing the system, but I'm not afraid. I saw a chance to be something bigger, and I took it. That's what you taught me. Recognize opportunity. I taught you to be smart, not disloyal, Bumpy's voice cracked. I taught you to build something that lasts, not to chase quick money. And I taught you that some relationships matter more than profit. You learned everything except the most important lesson. The silence stretched between them like a wound. Frank, you have two choices. Shut down this operation, come back to working with me, and we can rebuild trust over time. Or you continue, and this becomes war. Because I can't have someone operating in my territory, using my resources, recruiting my people, and calling themselves independent. Choose. Frank's hands trembled, but his voice stayed steady. Boss, I respect you. I love you, but I'm not shutting down. I've seen what's possible. I'm not going back to being small. If you can't accept that, then I guess we're enemies now. For the first time, Frank saw Bumpy look old, tired, hurt. The strong shoulders sagged under invisible weight. Then we're enemies, Bumpy whispered. And Frank, I will fight you, not because I hate you, because you're destroying everything I built, and I can't let that happen. Frank walked out, father figure and surrogate son now enemies. The battle for Harlem had begun. The war for Harlem lasted 12 brutal months. Frank moved like a businessman building a startup, offering better product at better prices, recruiting Bumpy's dealers with pure economics instead of sentiment. Bumpy fought like a general defending a fortress, leveraging 40 years of relationships with Italian Mafia partners, using police connections to arrest Frank's dealers, holding defensive positions while Frank attacked everywhere at once. Frank had youth, energy, blue magic, and profit margins that made greed look like strategy. Within 6 months, he controlled 30% of Harlem's heroin trade, territory he'd carved directly from Bumpy's empire. Bumpy had respect, community ties, institutional knowledge, and connections that reached into every power structure in New York. But respect couldn't compete with money. Loyalty couldn't match profit, and Frank's model was simply more profitable. January 1966 brought the defection that broke Bumpy's heart. Nicky Barnes, one of Bumpy's top lieutenants, a soldier he'd mentored for years, walked into Frank's operation offering his services, not because he hated Bumpy, but because Frank paid better. Bumpy sat in his apartment that night, chest tight with pain that had nothing to do with his failing heart. His wife Mamie watched him with worried eyes. I'm losing to Frank because he doesn't care about the things I care about. He doesn't care about community, loyalty, or consequences. He just wants to win, and that makes him dangerous. The violence escalated. Frank took one of Bumpy's major corners through force, running off dealers who'd worked that block for a decade. Bumpy retaliated with arrests. Frank responded by undercutting prices so severely that Bumpy lost money on every sale. Strategic became personal. Personal became violent. Both men understood now this would end with only one of them standing. March 1967, 2 years into the war, and the math was brutal. Frank controlled 60% of Harlem's heroin trade. Bumpy was down to 40% and bleeding territory every month like a wounded animal. Bumpy sat with Illinois Gordon in his apartment, staring at numbers that told the story of his obsolescence. Frank represents the future, Bumpy said quietly. I represent the past. The past doesn't win battles against the future. Frank was making more money than Bumpy ever dreamed possible. Better product, more dealers, more territory. Everything Bumpy built over 40 years, Frank was taking in 2. Frank told himself this proved everything, that his ambition was justified, that Bumpy's caution had been holding them both back. But late at night, alone in his apartment counting money that felt increasingly meaningless, Frank couldn't shake the emptiness. Why doesn't winning feel better? He asked Nicky Barnes one night.
I'm getting everything I wanted. Why do I still feel like I'm losing?" Nikki had no answer. April brought Bumpy's heart attack. Minor, the doctor said, but a warning. 3 days in the hospital, his wife holding his hand while doctors explained that stress was killing him. "You need to step away from business," the doctor said. "I can't step away while Frank is destroying everything I built." 2 weeks later, Carmine Tramonti, Bumpy's Italian Mafia partner for 20 years, came to the apartment with barely concealed threat in his voice. "Bumpy, Frank's direct sourcing is cutting into our profits. Either you control him or we will."
Bumpy understood then. The conflict had grown beyond personal. It was attracting attention neither of them could afford. He needed to end this war, surrender to Frank or destroy him. The problem, Bumpy still loved Frank like a son. May 1968. After 3 years of war, Bumpy's call came like a ghost reaching across a battlefield. They met at the apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, the same place they'd met hundreds of times before betrayal turned mentor into enemy. Frank wasn't prepared for how Bumpy looked. The man who once commanded every room now seemed diminished, older. The stress and conflict carved into every line of his face. Bumpy was 63, but looked 75. "Frank, we need to end this." Bumpy's voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical. "Not because I'm losing, though I am, but because what we're doing is destroying Harlem. Your way makes more money, but it's bringing more violence, more attention, more federal scrutiny. The community is suffering. We need peace." "Boss, you talk about community, but the community has always suffered." Frank's defenses rose automatically. "At least now some of us are getting rich. You spent 40 years building an empire that made you comfortable. I spent 2 years building an empire that made me a millionaire. That means my way is better." "Frank, you won the territory. You haven't won anything that matters." Bumpy leaned forward and Frank saw genuine pain in those tired eyes. "You think being king is about having the most money? It's about having something worth protecting. You built an empire with no foundation. The moment pressure comes, federal investigation, mafia retaliation, internal betrayal, everything you have will collapse because you have money but no loyalty, territory but no respect, power but no wisdom." "I have loyalty. My people are loyal to me." "Your people are loyal to your money." Bumpy's truth cut like a blade. "The moment someone offers them more, they'll leave. I know because that's how you recruited them. You offered more than I did. That's not loyalty. That's employment. And employees quit." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid over 3 years of war. "Frank, I loved you like a son. I still do, even after everything." Bumpy's voice cracked. "That's why this hurts so much. I'm not just watching my empire fall. I'm watching the son I raised become someone I don't recognize. Someone who values money over people, ambition over loyalty, winning over what's right." For the first time, Frank fully understood what he'd done. Not just taken territory, but destroyed a relationship that mattered more than any empire. "Boss, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to be like this." "You meant exactly for it to be like this. You wanted to win. You won." Bumpy stood slowly, looking at Frank with finality that felt like death. "But don't come to me when it all falls apart, because it will, and I won't be here to help you anymore. We're done, Frank." Frank left that apartment knowing he'd just lost the only father he ever had. 2 months later, Bumpy Johnson was dead. July 7th, 1968, 6:47 a.m. The phone rang and Frank answered with the fog of sleep still clinging to his brain. He's gone. 2 words, that's all it took. Bumpy Johnson, dead at 62, heart attack. Frank dropped the phone. The grief hit immediately, overwhelmingly. not just for losing his mentor, but for losing him while they were enemies. The last words between them were anger and finality. No reconciliation, no peace. Just, "We're done, Frank," echoing across 2 months of silence that would stretch into eternity. Frank sat on the edge of his bed and understood with sickening clarity. The stress of their conflict had killed Bumpy. 3 years of war, territory losses, watching his life's work crumble, the betrayal of the son he'd raised, it had all contributed to Bumpy's heart giving out. Frank had killed the man he loved, not with violence, but with ambition. The funeral came 3 days later. Frank withdrew his entire life savings, $100,000 in cash, not to claim power, he already had that, but as tribute, apology, guilt offering wrapped in $100 bills. At the funeral, Frank placed the money on Bumpy's body. Everyone interpreted it as claiming the throne. Only Frank knew the truth. It was him saying, "I'm sorry, I was wrong, I wish I could take it back," to a man who could no longer hear. After the funeral, Frank was king of Harlem, controlled 80% of the heroin trade, made $1 million per day, everything he'd wanted. But Bumpy was dead, and Frank felt nothing but emptiness. He'd won the throne, but lost the only person whose approval had ever mattered. Over the next 5 years, Frank built an empire that made him the richest black criminal in American history. But he was alone. No mentor, no father figure, no one who knew him before he was powerful. No one knew him when he was nobody from North Carolina with nothing but dreams and desperation. Nobody treated him like family. Everyone was an employee or an enemy. Even his wife looked at him differently now, not seeing Frank Lucas, but seeing the empire, the money, the power. Late at night, Frank would think about Bumpy's final words, "You built an empire with no foundation." He understood now. His people followed from greed, not loyalty. His power rested on money that could disappear with one federal investigation. His success was hollow because the one person he'd wanted to impress was dead, killed by the stress of watching Frank destroy everything he built. 1975, federal agents arrested Frank Lucas, and the empire collapsed exactly as Bumpy predicted. In his cell, Frank had nothing but time to reflect on the cost of his ambition. "Bumpy told me I'd win, but lose. I didn't understand. I thought winning meant having money and power. I was wrong. Winning means having someone who loves you even when you have nothing. Bumpy loved me. I betrayed him for an empire. I got the empire, but I lost the only person whose respect it ever mattered. That's why Bumpy was right. You can win the throne and lose everything. I'm proof." The battle between Frank Lucas and Bumpy Johnson ended with both men losing what they valued most valuable. Bumpy Johnson died July 7, 1968, age 62, having lost his territory but maintained his principles to the end. Frank placed $100,000 on Bumpy's body, part tribute, part apology, part guilt offering wrapped in $100 bills. Frank built the empire Bumpy predicted, becoming one of the richest criminals in American history. But Frank lost what money couldn't buy, Bumpy's approval. That's the cost of ambition. Sometimes getting what you want means destroying the person who made you capable of getting it.